the farmer, the visionary, and the whispers of the West. The legend of Ragnar Lothbrok does not begin amidst the thunder of a great battlefield or within the golden halls of a king, but in the stark, freezing mud of a modest farm in Kattegat. The year is roughly 793 AD, a time when the Norse world was trapped in a cycle of violent stagnation. For generations, the Vikings had followed the same predictable path. Every summer, when the ice melted, the raiding parties would sail east. They targeted the Baltic lands and the river systems of Russia, territories that were vast but dangerously poor. The people there had no gold, no silver, and no temples filled with treasures. They fought fiercely for meager scraps of fur and slaves. Viking society was ruled by conservative ERLs, men like Earl Haraldson, who were content to maintain the status quo, hoarding what little wealth existed and keeping the population in a state of managed obedience. Ragnar was fundamentally different. To his neighbors, he was a farmer and a warrior, a man who loved his wife, the shield maiden Lagertha, and his children. But beneath the surface of this ordinary existence lay a mind that was restless, dangerous, and touched by what many believed was the divine madness of the gods. Ragnar claimed a lineage that traced directly back to Odin, the All-Father. This claim was not merely vanity. It was a statement of intent. Odin had plucked out his own eye for a drink from the well of Mimir to gain wisdom. Ragnar was willing to sacrifice the safety of his life for the knowledge of what lay beyond the horizon. He was possessed by a singular, consuming obsession. The West. Rumors had long drifted through the trade routes, whispers of a land across the open, terrifying ocean, a land called England, rich with gold, silver, and fertile soil, guarded by a strange god and defended by weak men. To the Norse leadership, specifically Earl Haraldson, these were dangerous fantasies that would lead good ships to their deaths in the endless, stormy abyss of the North Sea. Navigation across the open ocean was considered impossible. Without a coastline to follow, a ship was blind, destined to be lost forever in the gray wastes. Ragnar, however, sought to weaponize technology against tradition. His ambition was fueled by two critical innovations developed in secret. The first was a relationship with the eccentric genius boat builder Floki. Floki designed a revolutionary new type of longship that utilized a massive, single-spine keel and overlapping strakes. This construction allowed the ship to be incredibly light and flexible, twisting with the waves rather than crashing against them. It was a vessel designed not just for coastlines, but to ride the ocean swell like a sea serpent. The second innovation was the Sunstone. Ragnar had acquired a mysterious crystalline spar and a shadowboard. This navigational tool capitalized on the polarization of light. Even on the perpetually cloudy gray days of the North Sea, the crystal could detect the sun's position. Combined with the shadowboard to maintain a bearing, this tool was the key to the impossible voyage, transforming the open ocean from a chaotic death sentence into a navigable highway. The tension in Kattegat reached a breaking point at the annual Thing Assembly. Earl Haraldson announced the summer raids would once again head east. Ragnar stood up, publicly challenging the most powerful man in his world, and proposed the voyage to the west, the Earl. Seeing Ragnar's charisma as an existential threat to his authority, humiliated him, forbidding the voyage and threatening to confiscate his farm. The message was clear: stay in your place or be destroyed. But Ragnar was past the point of return. He gathered a small, secretive crew of loyal friends and family, including his brother Rolowa, man of immense strength, but plagued by jealousy. They met in secret at Floki's hidden shipyard, loading the new vessel with supplies and weapons. As they pushed the boat into the water, leaving behind the safety of the fjords, they were committing treason. The departure was a moment of terrifying silence. As the coast of Scandinavia faded into the mist, the reality of their situation settled in. They were alone in the vast, heaving Atlantic, a speck of wood in a universe of water. There were no landmarks, no birds, and no guarantee that England even existed. Crew members began to doubt, fear creeping in with the cold fog. But Ragnar stood at the helm, the sunstone in his hand. staring into the gray void with the icy blue eyes of a man who sees a destiny no one else can comprehend. He was gambling everything on a direction that pointed nowhere, guided only by a stone, a shadow, and the whispers of Odin. Ragnar Lothbrok was no longer just a farmer. He had crossed the threshold into legend. The first raid. Blood on the sand of Lindisfarne. The journey across the open ocean transformed into a test of sanity, far greater than any shield wall battle. For endless days that bled into freezing nights, Ragnar's small crew drifted through the gray, suffocating purgatory of the North Sea fog. The silence of the void was heavy, broken only by the creaking timber and the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull. These were seasoned warriors, accustomed to the certainty of coastal navigation, but here they were paralyzed by the emptiness. There was no horizon, no stars, and no comfort. The doubt that Earl Haraldson had planted in their minds began to take root like a rot. Mutiny hung heavy in the damp air. Whispers circulated among the men that Ragnar was not favored by the gods, but cursed by them. A madman leading his brother and friends into a watery grave from which there would be no return to Valhalla. Rollo, Ragnar's brother, sat brooding at the prow, his loyalty fraying with every passing hour. Even Floki, the genius builder, seemed haunted by the groaning of the wood, fearing his design would become their collective coffin. Ragnar alone remained unyielding. He sat by the sunstone, obsessed, checking the angle of the polarized light against the shadowboard, trusting in the physics of the crystal over the fear of men. He navigated not by sight, but by an unwavering, almost fanatical belief in his destiny. He knew that to show even a flicker of doubt would mean immediate death at the hands of his own crew. Then, the sound cut through the mist, the cry of a gull. A seabird. The crew scrambled to the gunwales, staring into the white void until the gray curtain finally lifted. Ahead of them, rising from the mist like a green jewel, was a coastline unlike any they had ever seen. It was lush, verdant, and terrifyingly open. They had found England. Specifically, they had drifted toward the Kingdom of Northumbria, arriving at the tidal island of Lindisfarne, known to the locals as the Holy Island. As the longship's keel scraped against the sandy beach, the Vikings disembarked into an alien world. The air smelled of salt and rich, fertile earth. But what struck them most was the silence. There were no gods, no watchtowers, no warriors lining the cliffs. Instead, they heard a sound entirely foreign to their ears. The ringing of a bell. They followed the sound over the dunes, until they stood before a massive stone structure, the monastery of St. Cuthbert. To the Norsemen, who worshipped gods of war and thunder, this exposed, undefended building filled with gold and unarmed men was incomprehensible. It seemed like a trap. The encounter that followed changed history. The monks of Lindisfarne, seeing the strange dragon-headed ship and the axe-wielding men, did not run. They walked out to meet them, believing these were traitors. They had no concept of the violence about to be unleashed. For Ragnar, confusion turned instantly to bloodlust. When a monk raised across a piece of solid gold, Ragnar realized the stories were true. The wealth here was unguarded. The raid on Lindisfarne was a massacre. The Vikings unleashed a storm of brutality. Axes cleaved through robes and flesh. The holy sanctuary was turned into a slaughterhouse. Floki, manic with adrenaline, desecrated the altar, laughing at the weakness of this white Christ who would not strike them down. They stripped gold from the walls, smashed open reliquaries to dump out bones, and filled their chests with silver chalices. It was more wealth in 1 hour than they had seen in a lifetime of raiding the East. Amidst the carnage, Ragnar found something more valuable than gold. He cornered a young monk named Athelstan, who, terrified, began to speak in the Norse tongue, a broken dialect learned from missionaries. Ragnar paused. In a culture where foreign knowledge was rare, a man who could speak the enemy's language was a key. He enslaved the monk, binding him not just in ropes, but in his own fascination with this strange culture. The return was a procession of triumph. The longship sat low, weighed down by silver and gold, the decks stained with blood. as they pushed off the blood-soaked sand, leaving the monastery burning against the sky. The crew looked at Ragnar with new reverence. The doubt was gone, replaced by awe. He had done the impossible. He had sailed the open ocean, found the land of the gods, and taken its treasure without losing a man. But Ragnar knew this was only the beginning. As he looked back at the burning island, with Athelstan shivering at his feet, he realized he had not just found treasure, he had found a door. He had exposed the vulnerability of an entire civilization. The West was open, rich, and weak. They were returning to Kattegat as heralds of a new age. The raid on Lindisfarne was over, but the Viking Age had just begun, and Ragnar Lothbrok was bringing the storm home. The Earl's envy, the confiscation, and the war for Kattegat. The return of Ragnar Lothbrok to the fjord of Kattegat was a seismic event that shattered the established order of Viking society. As the longship glided into the harbor, sitting low in the water under the crushing weight of Northumbrian gold and silver, the people gathered in stunned silence. They were looking at men who had returned from the dead. Ragnar had defied the Earl, sailed into the forbidden void of the West, and returned not only alive but wealthier than any raiding party in living memory. In that moment, power shifted visibly from the Great Hall to the deck of Ragnar's ship. Earl Haraldsson, watching from the shadows, understood the threat immediately. Ragnar was no longer a nuisance. He was a rival king in all but name. The Earl's reaction was cold and calculated. He summoned Ragnar to the Great Hall and invoked ancient Viking law. As the Earl and sponsor of all raids, he claimed the legal right to the entire horde. It was a move designed to strip Ragnar of his power. If Ragnar refused, he would be branded a traitor. If he accepted, he would be humiliated. The tension in the Great Hall was suffocating. Ragnar saw the trap. He allowed the Earl to take the gold and silver. But when Haraldsson mockingly offered Ragnar permission to keep one item from the horde as a souvenir, Ragnar did not choose a chalice or a weapon. He chose the slave, Athelstan. The Earl laughed, thinking Ragnar a fool. He did not understand that Ragnar had secured the most valuable weapon in the hall. Athelstan was a living map, Ragnar mind, the monk's mind for intelligence. Learning of the kingdoms of England, their politics, and the location of their inland cities. While the Earl counted coins, Ragnar was gathering the intelligence to conquer a continent. However, the peace was an illusion. Haraldsson knew that as long as Ragnar lived, his own authority was crumbling. The Earl authorized a second raid to the west, but planted a spy his own brother, Canute, among Ragnar's crew. The mission was ostensibly to find treasure, but Canute's secret orders were to sabotage Ragnar's leadership. The second voyage confirmed that the first was no fluke. Ragnar successfully navigated back to England, but the conflict exploded on the beach when Canute attempted to rape Ragnar's wife, Lagertha, and asserted the Earl's authority. Lagertha killed him. It was self-defense, but it gave Earl Haraldsson the legal pretext he needed. Upon their return, Ragnar was arrested and put on trial for murder. The Great Hall became a courtroom of death. Haraldsson expected a swift execution, but he underestimated Ragnar's influence. The crew, though bribed, faltered under the intense gaze of the community. Ragnar was acquitted, dealing a humiliating public defeat to the Earl. Haraldsson realized the law could no longer protect him. He decided to strike first, breaking the ultimate taboo, attacking a free man's home. Under the cover of darkness, the Earl sent a massive warband to Ragnar's farm. The attack was total. Fire arrows rained down, turning the farm into an inferno. Ragnar, waking to the smell of smoke, realized he was trapped. He fought with the desperation of a cornered wolf, holding the doorway alone against dozens of men to buy time for Lagertha and the children to escape. Pierced by arrows and beaten to his knees, he threw himself into the ravine behind his house, vanishing into the icy water. Haraldsson watched the farm burn, satisfied. He believed Ragnar was dead, but he had made a fatal error. They never found the body. Ragnar Lothbrok, broken and bleeding, was not dead. He was hiding in the deep woods, nursed by Floki, and he was no longer fighting for gold. He was fighting for revenge. The explorer had died in the fire. The king was being born in the blood of the Earl, and the rise of the king. Ragnar Lothbrok lay on the edge of death in the hidden sanctuary of Floki's hut, his body shattered by the fall and the wounds inflicted by Earl Haraldsson's assassins. For weeks, he drifted between fever and consciousness. His survival kept a closely guarded secret to the world and to the tyrannical Earl. Ragnar was a dead ghost. But while Ragnar's body healed, the political rot in Kattegat deepened. Earl Haraldsson, paranoid and haunted, began a brutal reign of terror, imprisoning Ragnar's friends and demanding absolute loyalty from a populace that despised him. The tipping point came when Ragnar, still weak and barely able to stand, decided the time for hiding was over. He understood that a leader who hides is forgotten. He sent Floki into the heart of Kattegat with a message that froze the court. A formal challenge to a Holmganga ritual single combat to the death. Earl Haraldsson, driven by pride and the fatalistic belief that the gods had abandoned him, accepted the challenge, knowing that refusing a duel from a dead man would strip him of his last shred of respect. The duel took place in the center of the village under a gray sky. It was not a clash of armies, but a primal, intimate struggle between the old power and the future. Haraldsson, armored and fighting with the brute force of established authority, faced Ragnar, wounded and fighting with the desperate ingenuity of survival. The fight was brutal. Shields were shattered. Steel bit into flesh. Ragnar was driven to his knees, his sword knocked away, but he possessed a will that transcended physical strength. In a final, blindingly fast move, he utilized a hidden knife, catching the Earl off guard. The blow was fatal. As Earl Haraldsson slumped into the mud, dying, he acknowledged Ragnar's victory. The silence that followed was deafening. The Earl's guard hesitated, unsure whether to attack the exhausted victor. It was Rollo, finally free from his chains, who ended the indecision, killing the Earl's second in command. Ragnar Lothbrok was instantly hailed as the new Earl. The ascension of Ragnar marked a fundamental shift in the Viking world. He did not want to rule a village. He wanted to open the world. He immediately ordered the construction of a fleet. One ship was no longer enough. He wanted an armada capable of carrying an army. Central to this ambition was the former monk, The relationship between the Viking Earl and the Christian slave had deepened into a complex, intellectual bond. Athelstan, torn between his Christian faith and the raw power of the Norse gods, became Ragnar's most vital advisor. He taught Ragnar not just the geography of England, but its psychology. He explained the concept of kings, the political divisions, and the crucial fact that the Christians gathered unarmed in their churches on Sundays. Ragnar realized that the true wealth of the West was not just gold, but land and political power. Under Ragnar's rule, the summer raids transformed. They were no longer blind gropes into the fog. Ragnar led his new fleet back to Northumbria, but this time, he moved inland, targeting the fortified tyranny of King Earl. The clash was inevitable. The Saxon armies, reliant on rigid formations, were unprepared for the ferocity and speed of the Viking shield wall. Ragnar defeated Earl's forces in open battle, capturing the king's brother and ransoming him for a massive sum of Danegeld gold and silver. But for Ragnar, the gold was secondary. He had looked into the eyes of King Earl and seen fear, but also recognition. He realized that to truly secure his legacy, he could not just be a raider. He had to be a conqueror. The gods had given him the vision, the throne, and the map. Now, they demanded a legacy. As the winter ice set in, locking the ships in the harbor, Ragnar sat on the Earl's throne, planning a campaign that would not just raid England, but bring it to its knees. The warlord had risen. The siege of Paris and the price of ambition. Years passed, transforming Ragnar Lothbrok from a rebel jarl into the most feared power in Scandinavia. His raids on England continued, building a fortune that eclipsed the wealth of every other earl. But Ragnar's ambition had outgrown Kattegat. He realized that To truly become a king, he needed to unite the fractured Norse clans and strike a target so audacious it would be remembered forever. That target was Paris. Paris, the heart of the fragmented Frankish kingdom, was the richest, most heavily fortified city in Western Europe. Ruled by the indecisive King Charles the Bald, attacking it required a massive, unified force. Ragnar knew he could not finance this alone. He sought an uneasy alliance with the mighty but deeply suspicious King Horik, offering him a substantial share of the expected plunder. Horik, wary of Ragnar's growing shadow, agreed, but only to monitor the ambitious former farmer. The resulting alliance gathered the largest Viking fleet ever assembled, over 120 carrying thousands of seasoned warriors, including Ragnar's sons Bjorn and Ivar, who were now men grown in the shadow of their father's legend. The campaign began with a devastating, organized thrust up the Seine River, the site of the massive fleet. The dragon heads reflected in the tranquil waters of the Frankish interior sent the populace into blind panic. King Charles the Bald, unprepared for a war of this scale, fled his capital, taking refuge in St. Denis. His few standing armies, attempting to block the Vikings' advance, were systematically and brutally crushed by Ragnar's relentless shield wall. Ragnar was demonstrating strategic military genius. This was no mere raid, but a full-scale invasion designed to cripple an empire. The fleet reached Paris in the spring. The city was protected by high stone walls, but Ragnar, utilizing siege tactics learned from Athelstan, blockaded the river and began the assault. The Vikings were used to swift battles, but this was a war of attrition. Weeks bled into months. The Norsemen, frustrated by the siege's slow progress, were soon met by an enemy they could not fight with steel. The plague, dysentery and fever, brought on by poor sanitation and the stagnant waters of the besieged river, swept through the Viking camp with terrifying speed. Hundreds of warriors died daily. The moral of the army shattered. They had defeated the king's army, but they were being destroyed by the Christian god's invisible weapon. Ragnar watched his army die, realizing that the great victory was turning into a catastrophic spiritual and military defeat. He changed his approach. Rather than forcing the breach, he sent a messenger to King Charles the Bald. Ragnar offered not surrender, but terms. He demanded an astronomical ransom, 7,000 pounds of gold and silver Danegeld, to lift the siege and spare the city. Charles, fearing both the disease spreading through the countryside and the renewed fury of the Vikings if they were desperate, agreed. Ragnar returned to Kattegat, the richest man in the north, carrying a vast treasure that bought him not only land and loyalty, but the envy of all the kings. Yet, the triumph was tainted. The Viking Age had reached its strategic peak, proving they could hold Europe's greatest cities hostage, but the cost was immense. The success created internal fractures. King Horik returned full of resentment, seeing Ragnar not just as a subordinate, but as a dangerous rival who had secured too much power. Meanwhile, the psychological pressure on Athelstan reached a breaking point. The monk, who had once fled Lindisfarne, had seen the brutal truth of the Norse gods, only to watch them be defeated by a Christian plague outside Paris. His divided loyalty, his heart belonging to Christ, his mind belonging to Ragnar, would soon have fatal consequences for the Viking world. The greatest threat to Ragnar's power no longer lay across the sea, but within the walls of his own great hall. The knife of betrayal and the fall of the king. The air in Kattegat was thick with unspoken rivalry. Ragnar's triumphant return from Paris had elevated him beyond the status of a mere earl, making him a kingmaker. But this success only intensified the lethal paranoia of King Horik. Horik could not tolerate the sight of Ragnar, a former farmer, accumulating so much power. The final conflict would not be fought with armies, but with psychological warfare, targeting the vulnerabilities of Ragnar's inner circle. Horik's manipulation was subtle but precise. He targeted two key figures plagued by internal strife, the devout genius boat builder, and Rollo, Ragnar's resentful brother. Rollo was offered titles and land in exchange for treason, a temptation his jealousy made almost impossible to refuse. But the most effective manipulation was aimed at Floki. Horik played upon Floki's fundamentalist devotion to the Norse gods. He convinced the boat builder that Athelstan, the Christian monk, was a spiritual infection, a disease that had contaminated Ragnar's mind and was responsible for the plague that had crippled the Viking army outside Paris. Floki, consumed by zealotry and a desperate need to protect Ragnar from the White Christ, agreed to eliminate the threat. The act of betrayal was one of devastating, personal tragedy. Athelstan. Tormented by his divided loyalties, his love for Ragnar versus his rediscovered faith in Christ, was praying alone on a hilltop at dusk. Floki approached him with an axe, not in malice, but in a profound, misguided act of religious purification. Athelstan offered no resistance. He accepted his martyrdom, and Floki struck the fatal blow, believing he was saving the soul of the Viking world. Ragnar's reaction to finding Athelstan's body was a moment of terrifying, controlled grief. He did not lash out. He did not rage. His sorrow was a silent, deep earthquake. He buried the monk on the hilltop where he fell, marking the grave with a Christian cross final. Defiant acceptance of the man Athelstan was. The murder stripped Ragnar of his most trusted counsel and spiritual anchor, hardening his heart irrevocably. He knew immediately that Horik was responsible. The final confrontation was orchestrated by Ragnar, a master trap concealed beneath the pretense of a feast. Horik, believing he had successfully eroded Ragnar's circle, arrived at the Great Hall with his entire family and retinue, prepared to stage his coup and execute Ragnar's family. But Ragnar anticipated the move, utilizing his sons, Bjorn and Ivar, who were now deadly warriors. The resulting slaughter was swift and absolute. As Horik attempted to seize the throne, the signal was given. The doors were locked. The fight was personal. Ragnar and his sons fought. Bjorn killed the bulk of Horik's men. Rollo, who had seemingly betrayed Ragnar only to reveal his loyalty at the crucial moment, blocked the main exit. Ragnar himself cornered Horik, killing the rival king with a ferocity that demonstrated how much of his soul had been consumed by the betrayal of Athelstan. Every last member of Horik's family was eliminated, except for one son, who was spared to carry the tale. Ragnar was now the undisputed king, not just of Kattegat, but of the united Viking forces. He had removed every internal threat, but the victory was hollow. He had lost his closest friend, destroyed his relationship with Floki, and been forced to kill his enemies in cold blood. The ambitious farmer had finally achieved his throne, but the cost was his humanity. He sat alone, crowned with tragedy, focused now entirely on England. The quest for revenge against King Earl, the ruler who had humiliated him years ago, was no longer just a political goal. It was a personal, consuming need. The final sacrifice. The pit of vipers. Ragnar Lothbrok, now the undisputed king, sat heavy on his throne. The external threats were gone, and the wealth was vast. Yet he was utterly hollow. The great ambition that once drove him had been replaced by a quiet, restless despair following Athelstan's murder. Ragnar was a warrior, an explorer, and a revolutionary he was not. An administrator. The daily life of ruling was a cage. He no longer sought gold or land. He sought Valhalla. He sought the glorious death of a true Viking king. Ragnar devised a final, suicidal plan. He decided to attack King Earl of Northumbria, the man he had humiliated years prior with a force so small it was an insult. Only 2 ships. His sons, Bjorn, Ivar, and Ub, saw the truth in their father's eyes. They recognized his death wish and pleaded with him to take the full fleet, but Ragnar was resolute. He knew that to die in a great army was expected. To die alone, defying the odds, was the mark of a legend. His final voyage was not a raid, but a deliberate challenge to fate. The voyage was doomed from the start. Ragnar's small fleet was caught in a massive North Sea storm. The longships, built for speed and raid, were no match for the relentless waves. The ships were broken, and the few survivors who washed ashore on the Northumbrian coast were immediately captured by the soldiers of King Earl. Ragnar Lothbrok, the man who had terrified Europe for decades, was captured by the very king he had sought to destroy. King Earl, a petty tyrant whose pride had been wounded by years of Viking raids, was ecstatic. He had captured the man who was both his nightmare and his greatest opportunity. Earl tried to humiliate Ragnar, questioning him, demanding to know the location of his great fleet. Ragnar, knowing his death was imminent and that his silence was more powerful than any confession, refused to break. He spoke only in riddles of Odin and prophecy, frustrating Earl with his cold, unyielding defiance. Earl, seeking maximum cruelty and spectacle, devised a horrific end. He marched Ragnar to a clearing where a deep, circular pit had been dug. The pit was filled with poisonous snakes, brought from the damp marshes of the Northumbrian swamps. Ragnar was stripped, bound, and thrown into the pit of vipers. The death scene was one of legend. As the venomous serpents struck, Ragnar's spirit remained unbroken. He used his final moments not for plea, but for prophecy, casting a final, terrifying curse upon King Earl. With his last breath, Ragnar spoke the words that would seal his legacy and haunt the world. It gladdens me to know that Odin prepares for a feast. I shall soon be drinking ale from curved horns. I shall not lament my death. And when the little piglets hear how the old boar suffered, they will grunt. With those words, Ragnar Lothbrok died. The Viking Age's greatest hero was gone. The news of Ragnar's death and the shameful manner of his execution traveled back to carried by a survivor of the wreck. The grief of his sons Bjorn, Ivarub, and Sigurd was instantly transformed into a cold, terrifying rage. The little piglets heard the call of their father's suffering. They gathered every warship, every warrior, and every king who had ever followed Ragnar. This was no longer a matter of gold or land. It was a matter of Odin's vengeance. The stage was now set for the final act of Ragnar's legacy, the rise of the Great Heathen Army. Ragnar Lothbrok had sailed into the unknown and died for his ambition, but his sacrifice ensured that his sons would return to England, not as raiders, but as conquerors, to exact a blood price for every scale of every viper. The king was dead. The legend had become eternal.